The other day, I was innocently scrolling through my timeline when I saw a post that instilled a state of shock and fear into my bones. That post was stating we've endured 5 years. Yes. 5 years. Of Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino. And well, much like recently with the car, Arctic Monkeys were met with some funny looks on the release of this album half a decade ago, with certain people claiming that Tranquility Base was, and I quote, a bunch of weird nonsense. Alongside certain figures such as Noel Gallagher stating he expected at least a few choruses from the album, which were nowhere to be found. However, there were also other figures such as Damon Albarn, the incredibly handsome, the incredibly talented lead singer of Blur and frontman of Gorillaz, stating how he liked Tranquility Base, and that Alex Turner was one talented chap. So, after 1,825 days of listening to this album, is it true that it was just a bunch of weird nonsense? Firstly, I think we need to throw it back to 5 years ago when I was just a young whippersnapper at university. My favourite band had just released their new album after 5 long years since their absolute mega monster album of AM. Adverts for the album were everywhere, Arctic Monkeys ticket prices were soaring up towards £80, and I was certainly buzzing for Tranquility Base. I thought the singles they'd teased for the album, those being Anyways and Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, were a bit funky but nonetheless were fine and got me adequately excited. And then on the 10th of May the album dropped and I sat down ready to listen, and well, it wasn't quite what I expected to be hearing, and I was a tad salty and disappointed at first. My initial reaction to Tranquility Base wasn't that it was a bad album. I thought the music on it was actually quite good. But at first I thought it was a complete rip-off of The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie, which was and still is my favourite album of all time. And I knew that Alex Turner was a big Bowie fan, from him and Miles repeatedly performing Moon Age Daydream live with the Last Shadow Puppets, which is a song from that very album. So I felt a bit shortchanged and a bit disappointed that they released what I thought at the time was a bit of a cartoonish satirical version of one of the greatest albums of all time. But once I'd stopped being so defensive over Bowie and I'd re-listened to Tranquility Base a few times, I came to realise my initial reception of the album was, and wait for it, I was wrong. Absolute shock horror. Who knew opinions can change and you can be wrong? Certainly not 21-year-old me 5 years ago. But alas, my opinion changed, and pretty rapidly so. I simply heard the album to be heavily inspired by some of my favourite artists and began paying more attention to the actual record itself, rather than trying to be angry at the fact it sounded like other albums, and that's kind of where I started to really love this one. If you've seen my Arctic Monkeys album ranking video, you'll know Tranquility Base is my second favourite Arctic Monkeys album behind AM. And, well, outside of my initial David Bowie anger-filled reception of the album, it's a pretty far way to come. So why do I think it's so good alongside many other people who have taken to the album over the past 5 years also? As I said, I initially wasn't too keen on it, and not because the music was bad, but because I felt it was a rip-off album. So firstly, it's not a rip-off album. And even in my anger at the time, I could tell that the actual production and quality of the music on the album was good. I think this is an initial fact that a lot of people overlook. And surprisingly, change doesn't always equal bad. Unbelievable and groundbreaking stuff, I know. I'm an absolute philosopher. So I think the first reason people still haven't gelled with this album, or possibly the car, is due to the change in sound and them not even wanting to give it a chance. I know people state Humbug was a change up in sound, which I agree it was, but it wasn't as drastic as going from AM to Tranquility Base. And that's mainly because Tranquility Base was the first Arctic Monkeys album to be written on piano and not guitar. I think if someone genuinely has set aside their love for the past albums and given Tranquility Base a shot, and still doesn't like it, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to like it. But if not the change up in sound, what are some other reasons people like or don't like it? I think the album has quite a clear yet divisive concept that reflects deep feelings of melancholy, a yearning for the past and times that never existed, alongside deep feelings of regret and sadness, which unfortunately yet intentionally has been wrapped up in this goofy idea of there being a retirement home on the moon for rock stars. Yeah. Amazing how an album can have so many deep concepts and be filled with such emotion, only to be broken by lyrics such as "Kiss me underneath the moon's side boob," or reading the track list only to spot a song named "The world's first ever monster truck front flip," or even listening to arguably Arctic Monkeys' best written song, alongside Alex Turner's best vocal performance, only to be eclipsed by the title of "The Ultra Cheese." And whilst I agree Arctic Monkeys have always had a flair for long, elongated and slightly humorous track titles and lyrics, they really did seem to be taking the Michael with this album at times. So, to be honest, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword to that point. You either love the album for all of its deep insights and heavy emotion it portrays, being packaged up in a goofy and satirical nature, or you hate the fact that this album has potential, but it almost feels like one big joke that shouldn't be taken too seriously. Personally, I fall into the loving it section, but at times it does annoy me a little, as there is certainly a way to get the balance right, and they proved it on the album several times. For example, 1 Point Perspective is one of my favourite Arctic Monkeys songs ever. Now, I think this track captures those elements correctly. It starts off with peculiar lines of dancing in my underpants, I'm gonna run for government, and I'm gonna start a covers band and all. And all for the non-Yorkshire natives just means as well. But this song starts off strange and weird in nature, but progresses onto a pretty solemn and sad track that feels like it's the monologue of someone who was full of ambition and passion to be a performer, but just never made it. Instead, they spent their days performing to quiet rooms and reflecting on what felt like a wasted career in some sort of drunken haze, rambling on someone who just isn't listening to them, reflecting a sympathetic and pitiful story, really idealising the track's title of a true 1 Point Perspective. Now, when the track is followed by American Sports, a full-on Alex Turner sci-fi joker of a song, it does break the immersion of the listening experience for me. However, I do believe there are enough tracks like 1 Point Perspective that can deliver an emotional impact alongside a well-written and performed song that sticks to the theme of the album to pull it through. Another great feature of the album is reflected in the writing style and production of the record. In music, we talk a lot about space and how important space is. Ironically, when speaking about this album, I don't mean space as in science fiction, or the cosmos, or the retirement home located on the moon. I mean the gaps where music is or isn't being performed, and when vocals or instrumentals are allowed to shine, breathe, and take the lead. A great example of this is the song Bat Phone. There feels like an elasticated push and pull performance between the instrumental and Alex Turner's vocal performance on this track, where they feel as if they're constantly pushing towards one another, moving away, then snapping back towards one another, all whilst constantly fighting for who takes the front lead of the song. You can hear it from those initial piano chords that really feel like they're being dug in and allowed to breathe, which are then complemented by the strangest sci-fi noises before Alex's voice is introduced to the track. Now, this isn't a jazz album by any stretch, but it really is reminiscent of improv jazz where one instrument fights to take the lead and hijack the performance. A great part of the song to really highlight this in Bat Phone is around 2 minutes 15 seconds in, as Alex begins to say, "You go in through the door." If you re-listen to it, you'll notice how much space is being provided for Turner's vocal performance, alongside the piano filling in certain gaps and taking centre stage, only to be hijacked once again by Alex's vocals. For me, it's a great song that shows effective and deliberate writing styles that I felt was taken for granted on the album quite a lot. It highlighted real maturity and reflected how far Arctic Monkeys have developed their million-mile-an-hour, non-stop, all-killer, no-filler style that was on their first 2 albums. And it was a great style which I love, don't get me wrong, but I think it's great to see their progress as musicians and Alex's strength as a vocalist on the record. Another thing that I thought was quite significant when Arctic Monkeys returned with Tranquility Base was the actual attitude that the band brought back to their live performances. I mean, it literally looked like Alex Turner had been beamed down from space with his wild staring eyes that made it seem as if he'd been drinking too much of the space Kool-Aid. I think 2 great examples of this are the BBC Maida Vale set and also their performance at Transmit, both in 2018. It really felt like they were buzzing to be back and buzzing to show off their weird new album alongside performing the hits. Sadly, I haven't felt the same vibe from their new tour, or even in their interviews, or their live performances. And it's something I really appreciated at the time with their return with Tranquility Base. And I do feel it has gone amiss amid their return this time around. Overall, though, this album unapologetically sticks to its theme, which once again can make you love or hate the record as a whole. It fully anchors down on the angle of a retirement home for rock stars on the moon. A very goofy and jokey premise, which, my lord, it certainly sticks to and does see out on every track. Now, an issue with this is I'm not sure why the retirement home had to be on the moon. As an album based on a retirement home for rock stars, reflecting on disappointment, regret, confusion and sadness, but also great memories, would be a fantastic concept. And to be fair, is pretty well depicted throughout the album at times, in songs such as 1 Point Perspective, 4 out of 5, She Looks Like Fun, Bat Phone, and the Ultra Cheese. So why did they decide it had to be on the moon and had to be a sci-fi album? Who knows? But to be honest, I love it for that aspect, and it would be weird not to have it now. But it is incredibly strange and a bit odd, and I do see why people don't like it. In the same way, I understand why people don't like the album because of the change up from strictly rock to whatever amalgamation of styles you would call Tranquility Base. Honestly, your guess is as good as mine. But 5 years on from its release, Tranquility Base Hotel Casino is still going strong in my eyes and truly is an excellent album. I think maybe it is a bit of a misunderstood masterpiece in some ways, and it does reflect a lot of musical excellence alongside a strong and dedicated change up to Arctic Monkeys' style, all whilst also really dedicating itself to a specific theme, almost to a fault at times. And well, I hope over the past half decade, more fans have come round to this album and given it a true go. Saying that though, it is a bit of an odd and rather peculiar record, with a strange theme and some rather goofy lyrics at times, and I can see alongside the stylistic change-up why it didn't work for a lot of people, and maybe it never will. As for me, I still love this album and regularly visit it, and it has some of my favourite Arctic Monkeys tracks on it. I'm not sure I'd want to live on the retirement home on the moon that they depict through the album, but who knows? Maybe it'd be a laugh, and we can all take a good long look at the moon's side boob. Whatever on earth that's meant to mean. Do let me know in the comments if you're in the group that loves this album, or if you're on the side that isn't too keen on it, and why it works or doesn't work for yourself. As always, feel free to subscribe if you're new, and on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.